Well, hey folks, welcome everyone to this Lunch and Learn, this virtual Lunch and Learn at the Army and Navy Club. We got two great authors talking today about Gettysburg. I'm so glad you could join us. Let's talk about a few things that's going on. First of all, the club's open in case you don't know that. You got to make reservations. The Acri Lounge, you got to make reservations. They have to have it seated. We're following all DC restrictions. We actually had our first forum on Tuesday and we actually zoomed it out. So maybe some of you caught it. If not, all those, including some of the sessions that we taped before this time of COVID, are actually available on the club website. You can download them, listen to them as a podcast, or watch them on your TV. So like I said, Monday should be up, or Tuesday should be up there pretty soon. Tonight we have a Scotch night, Scotch tasting night. For any of you who have reservations, and they're all sold out, we have, you'll see me because we're going to be headed out that way. And I want to say, and I don't have the date handy, the next one's a Chivas Regal tasting, and that one looks like it's available. You can get it online and schedule that. Realize that a lot of these, Elizabeth sends a lot of these emails out, these flash emails, these burst emails. Please sign up, and if it's an inside club event, you may want to hurry because we are following the restrictions. We're a limited number of size and people, and so that's a problem that we're having. So a lot of things going on. We have a few virtual events coming up. A couple I want to talk about. The ones I have listed on my notes that I can see for some reason. I don't know why I can't see the rest. 21 October, we have a webinar on the Napoleonic Wars, and Dr. Alexander Mika-Berger, I believe he's from LSU, is going to be speaking to us on that. I try to get a little bit of diversity in there, and we rarely get somebody to talk about the Napoleonic Wars. We're also having a lot of folks from both the War College and Command and General Staff in the Army speaking to us. And in that case, on the 22nd of October, we have a webinar talking about Casas bovine and how cattle and the military strategy on two frontiers. And it's by Dr. Randy Mullis. That should be an interesting one. 27 October, we have an in-house forum. James Fenlon's going to be talking 4 Hours of Fury, and that's about Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine. 30 October, as I mentioned, Storm the Club Party. If you're not on my mailing list, it's foxconnorsociety@gmail.com to get on that. 7 November is our tribute to the armed forces, and right now I believe it's a full house, but feel free to get on the waiting list. And lastly, on the 1st of December, our long-awaited forum from author Peter Cozzens. He's wrote a lot on Civil War as well as on the Indian Wars. He'll be speaking at the club on his book, Tecumseh and the Prophet. So a lot of events coming up. And again, check your email box, go online, check RSVP where you can on the calendar. So let me introduce our two speakers. Jeff McCausland's a founder and CEO of Diamond 6 Leadership Strategy LLC. He also serves as a visiting professor of international affairs at Dickinson College and a former distinguished visiting professor of research at the U.S. Army War College. Jeff's a retired Army colonel, holds a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and is a West Point graduate. His military assignments include Office of Deputy Chief of Staff for plans on the Army staff and command of an artillery battalion during the Persian Gulf War. He's also Dean of the Army War College and a Director of Defense Policy and Arms Control on the National Security Council at the White House. And since retiring, he's chaired as professor of the U.S. Naval Academy in addition to his efforts with Diamond 6 to bring leadership, military leadership to the corporate world and community. Co-author Tom Vosser served 30 years active military service with the U.S. Army to include command of an infantry platoon in combat in Vietnam, as well as an infantry armor task force in Germany in the mid-1980s. Since retiring in 1998, Tom's worked as a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg, where he conducts upward of 50 battlefield tours annually, and I'm sure that number is a lot higher. For the past 10 years, Tom has served as leading historian for Diamond 6 on American Civil War battlefields of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Manassas. Tom's also co-author of two previous books on Gettysburg and one on Antietam. So, gentlemen, welcome to the Army-Navy Club's virtual Lunch and Learn, and thanks for joining us.
Well, Tom, thanks very much. I want to make a great shout out to you and Elizabeth for all your great efforts in coordinating this particular event. I want to thank everybody for joining us. A real shout out. I noticed real quickly when I glanced at the participant, an old friend of mine, John O'Shea, is on the call. So a shout out to John. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to share a screen here and show you a few slides. We're going to walk you through a kind of a quick synopsis of the book and the approach Tom and I took, and then we'll go into a Q&A. But first question people normally ask Tom and I is, well, how'd this all come about? Well, as you have ascertained from Tom's excellent introduction, Tom Vossler and I both were retired Army colonels. We met, for my good fortune, I met Tom Vossler when I was on the faculty at the Army War College and subsequently was the Dean of Academics, and Tom was the director of the Military History Institute. He retired, went on down to Gettysburg and became a park guide, and I began doing things in leadership development. And over time, he and I began working to develop a leadership seminar using the Gettysburg battlefield as both a classroom and a case study. We had, of course, been down there numerous times with military officers coming from the War College, of course. And you may all know or may not know that the park was, in part at least, created to allow military officers the opportunity to use it for military staff rides. But Tom and I firmly believe that it served as an excellent case study that you could focus on leadership and use that as a vehicle to talk to any audience about how they develop themselves as leaders now in the 21st century. I guess a couple of principles that Tom and I firmly believe in, and that is good leadership is good leadership, and the concepts and principles that make up good leadership are enduring. Doesn't matter whether you're leading the Hebrews out of Egypt, you're leading an ancient Rome during the American Revolution, the American Civil War, or today leading a church or leading a large corporation, a small company, a government agency, or a law firm, doesn't matter, or an Army-Navy club, these principles are in fact enduring. Second of all, of course, in a moment of great crisis, a moment of great stress on leaders, those principles and concepts stick out in bold relief. And clearly, a battle like the Battle of Gettysburg allows one to see those principles stick out in bold relief. And that's what we try to do in Battle Tested, is Tom provides an excellent history as we walk through the 3 full days of the battle. And then, of course, the speech, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. And then I, in each chapter, talk about the leadership principles and concepts illustrated by that particular portion of the narrative. With that as an intro, let's jump into this. One thing Tom and I were convinced from the onset, and we began Battle Tested with, is let's define what leadership is. We like this definition by Dwight Eisenhower, who many of you may also know. Not only was he president of the United States, not only was he a 5-star general commanding perhaps one of the most unbelievable military operations in all military history, he'd also been president of Columbia University from the time he leaves the White House until he becomes president. And of course, after he leaves the White House, he will retire to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We may talk about that more later on. I like this definition because clearly Eisenhower, a great leader, number one. Number two, it's brief. And number three, the last part I think is particularly interesting, get people to want to do it. I think why Eisenhower is wisely suggesting to any leader, if you're going to get max performance from your organization, no matter what that organization is, you need to try to get a certain amount of buy-in from the group to get max performance. We try to differentiate leadership and management. We think they are somewhat different. There is a Venn diagram. Cotter, who writes for the Harvard Business Review and has written many books on leadership, summarized it by saying management is about complexity and leadership is about dealing with change. Now, the one part of the definition I would say that is not included, which I think Eisenhower would say, well, that's implicit, is that leadership is all about character and integrity. Because again, you're not going to get max trust out of any group of people if they don't think you're a person of character, a person of ethics. And in fact, some people have gone so far as to say leadership is character in action. Why would you pick Gettysburg? Well, clearly one of the most significant battles in our history. Some would argue the turning point of the American Civil War. But I found it fascinating when I reviewed this speech by Joshua Chamberlain, who will be the commander of the 20th Maine in the desperate defense of Little Round Top by the Union on the afternoon of the second day. And of course, if Chamberlain had failed that day, he and his men had failed, the battle would likely have been a Confederate victory, and the whole history of the United States could turn very differently. You see here in 1889, he'll return to that spot on Little Round Top to dedicate a monument, which is there to this very day. And many of you who have been to Gettysburg have probably visited. And what I always found interesting about this was the last portion of his speech. And I'm going to read the last sentence. And reverent men and women from afar, and generations that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and to dream. So in a way, I would suggest that what Chamberlain was doing was in predicting that Tom Vossler and I were going to write a book, and we were going to write a book about Gettysburg, and we were going to look at this to offer people an opportunity to ponder particularly leadership concepts. I was struck by an interview I saw one time by Meryl Streep, who talked about how much she found the Ken Burns Civil War documentary to be impactful. And she said, you know, she took from that her career as an actress was in many ways to give a voice to the dead, because of course she performed in many plays that were written by people like Chekhov or Shakespeare, who had died long before she began her acting career. And so in a way, that's also what we're trying to do with Battle Tested. Let's jump ahead. The American Civil War. Of course, this occurs in the third year of the war. Nobody imagined it would last this long. By this poor time, June of 1863, the Confederacy is not doing terribly well out west. The Yankees almost control the entirety of the Mississippi River. They have done far better in the east. And of course, in May of 1863, Robert E. Lee nearly destroys the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Chancellorsville. They have a big meeting in Richmond of the political and military leadership to determine what they're going to do next. As a corporate body, they have a strategic planning conference. And Robert E. Lee is successful in convincing the leadership of the Confederacy to allow him to invade the North, seek a major battle on Union territory, defeat the Union Army again, and by so doing, perhaps tip the war in the Confederacy's favor. They knew full well there would be a major election, a presidential election in 1864, and the hope was that victory, even if they were unable to capture and hold a major city like Harrisburg or Washington even, or Philadelphia, might well tip that election to the opponents of Abraham Lincoln, who might well negotiate a separation and an end of hostilities. So he'll move his army westward to the Shenandoah Valley, go north, and as you can see, advance all the way up here to where I am in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But beginning on the 28th, 29th of June, he will send out orders for his army to consolidate at Gettysburg. At about the same time, an amazing thing happens for the Union Army, who is chasing him from the south, coming north into Maryland, into Pennsylvania. And that is Abraham Lincoln will basically accept the resignation or fire, and you can argue about that, his commander, Fighting Joe Hooker, and will replace him with General George Gordon Meade, who now is in command of this Army of the Potomac 2 days before this monumental battle is to begin. The first day of the battle, we see the Yankees defending out there on McPherson's Ridge. They are forced back by the end of the first day, flee through the town, and occupy Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. The book talks about a whole host of leadership principles and concepts. We're going to skip over the first day to allow more time for question and answer. And so now I'm going to turn it over to my historian, Tom Vossler, to pick up on the battle at that particular point, and then we'll go back and forth between Tom's narrative of history and the leadership insights I believe illustrated. Tom, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks. Well, indeed, first day's fighting, in fact, will begin just about a mile and a half from my farm here, west of the battlefield, and it'll go over the course of the entire day. As we have a meeting engagement actually between the leading forces of these two armies as they come together in a mass collision here on the ridges and the hills that surround the small 2,400 populated town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So as Jeff said, by the end of the first day, the Confederate attacks first from the west, and then in the afternoon from the west and the north will force the Union troops back through the town, back to Cemetery Hill, a reserve position established there. And that'll pretty much end the fighting on the first day. It'll get dark about 7:30 p.m. Soldiers trying to get some rest, something to eat, and then their leaders trying to figure out what to do next. Jeff, let's go to the next slide. So what's going to happen is the Confederates will maintain the initiative they gained on the first day by forcing the Yankees back. The Union position is outlined here in blue, and will take the shape, historically we refer to it as the fishhook position. The right end of the Union line established at Culp's Hill. It will then, the line extends up to Cemetery Hill, where we have the bend in the fishhook, and then the shank of the hook coming down Cemetery Ridge all the way down to Little Round Top. You'll notice that the bottom end of that line is a dashed line, and forward of it is a solid line. Well, the dashed line represents the position that should have been occupied by Union General Daniel Sickles and his 10,000 men of the Third Army Corps. However, Sickles decided he didn't want to occupy that line. He will push forward 3/4 of a mile, move his 10,000 guys all the way out to the Emmitsburg Road, establish a salient position in front of his assigned position, leaving empty of troops the hill known as Little Round Top, which is going to be a pivotal point in the battle. And so on the Confederate side, switching sides, what's going to happen, again, they're going to take the initiative and they're going to attack that Union line. And Confederate Commander Lee will order a main attack by General James Longstreet with 2 divisions he has present on the field, commanded by Generals Hood and McLaws. They're going to do the main attack, hit the left end of the Yankee line, and roll it up. And while they're doing that, over on the other end of the line, the right end of the Union line, is to be attacked by General Richard Buell and his 2 divisions that he has present on the field. And so we've got an attack on both ends of the line, and then attacks by A.P. Hill in the center to pin the center of that line down so those troops cannot be maneuvered left or right. So the first obstacle that has to be overcome then is the extended line of General Sickles that he had moved forward all the way out to the Emmitsburg Road. Next slide, Jeff. So the Confederate attack that goes in, it doesn't take too long before that forward line that Sickles established begins to collapse. And the Confederates are going to begin to break through there. The Confederate attack, actually, as it takes place, will be a right echelon attack, starting from the right, working its way to the left. That is, attack first in the south and work their way up to the north, starting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Orders were given for the attack at 8 o'clock in the morning by General Lee. But due to some circumstances of both personnel and terrain, the attack does not begin until 8 hours later. But so it's late in the day, 4 o'clock, the sun sets at 7:30 over South Mountain, and it'll become dark at that time. So they got 3.5 hours to prosecute this attack. So as the Confederates move forward, Sickles' line, that salient, subject to attack from 2 directions at the same time, does indeed collapse, as predictably it would. And the Confederates are really pushing Sickles' line back. Just before the Confederate attack started, General George Meade, the Union commander, realized Sickles was out of position, was not occupying the line he was supposed to occupy. And he rode out to see what was going on. But the Confederate attack began. It's too late to move back to Sickles' originally assigned position. So Meade promises reinforcements will be sent to Sickles to try and help him hold back the Confederate attacks. Part of the reinforcements that he sent a 4-brigade division out of the 2nd Corps and a 3-brigade division out of the 5th Corps. One of those 3 5th Corps brigades is commanded by Colonel Strong Vincent. Vincent's orders were to go to the wheat field to reinforce failure, to go to the wheat field to reinforce Sickles. However, next slide, Jeff. However, Colonel Vincent will encounter a lieutenant aide-de-camp to the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac, Brigadier General Gouverneur K. Warren. Warren had ridden to the top of Little Round Top, ostensibly to inspect the defense of the hill, amazed to find that there's nobody there to defend the hill. So he'll send this Lieutenant Ronald McKenzie, down the hill to find reinforcements. The lieutenant goes first to Sickles, who blows him off. Lieutenant continues to search for someone willing to come to the hill. He encounters Colonel Vincent, the brigade commander. The brigade commander originally intended to go to the wheat field. That was his orders. Vincent knows this lieutenant works for Warren. Vincent knows Warren by reputation in the Army. Vincent and Warren served together in the 5th Corps before Warren became the chief engineer. So Vincent inquires the lieutenant, what are you looking for? Do you have orders? And the lieutenant says, yes, sir. General Warren says that we need reinforcements on yonder hill to defend it from the Confederate attacks. Now, Vincent receives that information. Here's the rub. Warren's a staff officer. He has no command authority. The only thing Warren has command of is his own horse and his 2 lieutenants. That's it. He has no command authority over Vincent. Vincent's dilemma is, what's he going to do? Is he going to go to the wheat field to reinforce failure? Or, given new information from a trusted source, is he going to go to Little Round Top? Jeff.
Thanks, Tom. Well, as you see in this painting, ladies and gentlemen, it's a dramatization of this encounter between Colonel Strong Vincent and this particular courier. And I'll take away any of the anxiety at the moment to let you know, of course, that Vincent makes the quick and immediate determination to, in fact, violate his orders and move the troops you see in that painting up on Little Round Top, which is depicted there in the background. This is clearly an examination back to a leadership principle that I think is critical for any organization, and that is initiative, the willingness on the part of subordinate leaders to make decisions without guidance, because no one can find his divisional commander to ask, what should I actually do? He does this unhesitantly. And I would also argue, in a way, he illustrates a concept of initiative that was described by actually a very famous and more modern Air Force officer, and that is observe, orient, decide, and act. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this gentleman. His name is Colonel John Boyd. Boyd was a very famous fighter pilot during the Korean War. He'll return to the United States to be an instructor for combat pilots after the war, and he comes up with this paradigm, observe, orient, decide, and act, and uses that as a framework to train young fighter pilots. And I had the opportunity to meet John and sit through a presentation that he created following a series of books after he retired, where he took this same concept and applied it throughout history and applied it as a concept that any organization should use, particularly if they are in a competition. Boyd told me, oh, by the way, for our Air Force friends from the club who are on the call, that he would wager any young pilot that they could take off together, and within 5 minutes, he would be on their tail. As we all know, as military guys, fighter pilots are generally very humble and bashful people, but Boyd told me that he would, in fact, never fail, and he never had to buy a drink after one of those particular training exercises. This idea of observe, orient, decide, and act is exactly what Strong Vincent does. In essence, again, back to Boyd, observe the broader environment that you're operating in. Orient on what is the key thing going on in the environment you're operating in. Make a decision against that particular item, act, and do that more quickly than your competition. And he argued that in consequence, you would never lose. After, again, leaving the Air Force, he would spend a lot of time consulting in major corporations with that particular concept. You can, if you will, compare that to another concept written up in a book called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, in which Gladwell talks about the fact that decisions people take instantly or almost instantly or oftentimes as good or more often as good or better than the ones that they dwell on for a long period of time. In decision making and the OODA loop, one of the critical variables, of course, is time. So in fact, Strong Vincent, as you see depicted here, will move his troops on up to Little Round Top, including the 20th Maine, commanded by Joshua Chamberlain. He did, in fact, violate those orders. He was issued to go to the wheat field and could, in fact, theoretically, have been court-martialed. Of course, he was not, because it was obviously seen this was the correct thing to do, number one. But number two, sadly, Strong Vincent is killed in this defense of Little Round Top, and therefore that question is never, ever asked. In essence, by the afternoon of the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, to kind of summarize this concept of initiative, one could argue, I think, that the entire battle, in a way, hangs on two leaders, two hills, and the question of initiative. Obviously, Vincent making that choice on the afternoon of the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, which was critical to Union success. And on the first day, as Tom alluded to, and we haven't got time to go into it in detail, we can talk about it in the Q&A, Richard Ewell, who was given an order by Robert E. Lee to proceed and take Culp's Hill if he deems it practical to do so, at the end of the fighting on the afternoon of the 1st of July, decides not to do that, not to exercise that initiative. And obviously, historians argue about the prudence of that and will do so endlessly. Tom, let me pass it to you for the third day.
All right, so Little Round Top will be successfully defended by the Union Army. Will remain in the Union hands, and the whole line, the whole defensive line, 3.5 miles long from Culp's Hill up to Cemetery Hill, down Cemetery Ridge to the Round Tops, stays in Union hands. So in the morning, the next day, July 3rd, the Confederate commander Lee has to decide what to do. And I think after studying this for a long time, I think this is what's going through his mind. Their attacks on July 2nd, the second day of the battle, were very strong attacks. And they were stopped. They didn't achieve any breakthroughs. They did not seize all of their objectives. And they were stopped there because the Yankees were strong there. Lee understood the principles of the war. He studied these even back then. The principles of war go back to the time when he was a young officer. He understood the principles of mass and economy of force. So going through his mind, I believe, is the fact that Union Army is strong on the ends of the line, both ends of the line on the significant points there. And you can't be strong. You cannot create mass without having economy of force somewhere along that line. And the economy of force then is in the center of the line. Therefore, Lee will order an attack against the center of the line by General James Longstreet. What will amount to, and there's a lot of buildup to this, Longstreet does not want to make this attack. That's clear. He makes that very, very clear. Longstreet does not believe the attack can succeed. He tells Lee, he said, no 15,000 men ever created for battle can carry that position. But nonetheless, Lee's going to insist the attack be made. It won't be 15,000, it'll be 12,500 men will make the attack. So they spend the morning hours then in preparation. Jeff, next slide, please. And so it's going to look like this. You got the Union defenseless set it first. The center of the line that the Confederates are going to attack will be defended by troops under the overall command of General Winfield Scott Hancock. And then you can see the infantry deployed along the ridge, along the western face of the ridge, along which is a stone wall. That stone wall, many of you perhaps have been to Gettysburg, have seen that wall. But in the commentaries that you read of the soldiers, how high was that wall? Well, on the Union side, the soldiers say it was just high enough if I laid on my belly and pressed my belly into the ground, it would give me frontal protection of enemy fire. Confederate soldier against that same section wall described it as being waist high. So you can see there in that bottom picture, you can see General Hancock's view, or the view of his troops. There's the wall. You can see the view all the way across the tree line, across the field there. That is along Seminary Ridge. That is from where the Confederates will make their attack. So the attack by the Confederates will start at the south end of a mile-long line. You've got George Pickett's division of Virginians, 6,000 men in 3 brigades, commanded by Generals Kemper, Garnett, and Armistead. And they're going to make basically a left echelon attack to reach the center of the line, where the breakthrough at the angle of the stone wall. Now, those are 6,000 of 12,500. Where are the other 6,500 coming from? They're coming from 2 divisions of A.P. Hill's Corps. One division commanded by Brigadier General J. Johnston Pettigrew, who is acting in place of Henry Heath, the division commander. Heath is wounded. He got hit in the head by a spent piece of artillery shrapnel. He has a concussion. And under the concussion protocols of the time, on July 3rd, Henry Heath can't participate in the attack. Dorsey Pender's division is also involved. Pender, again, he's a first-day casualty. Pender is mortally wounded. They don't know he's going to die, but he is going to prove to be mortally wounded. Isaac Trimble will command his division. So 12,500 Confederates make an attack across 1.1 mile of open ground after a 2-hour artillery bombardment by 150 Confederate cannon. So you got that artillery bombardment and again, it's an artillery duel, except that the Union artillery will slow down and then cease their fire to conserve their ammunition for the infantry attack that's going to take place. And you've got a battle line, again, a mile from south to north, coming across all of that open ground in a target-rich environment. The upper photo gives you a picture of the Confederate artillery line looking toward the objective. The cluster of trees right there is the center of the objective. That's where the Confederates are at. So the attack moves forward, the Confederates move forward. As they move forward, the artillery fire of the enemy engages them as they're moving across the fields. If you were in the Confederate ranks that afternoon, you'd have heard leaders using phrases like, "Home, boys, home. Home is just over that hill. Keep moving forward, men. The firing can't last much longer." And so the Confederates push on. They push on up to the Emmitsburg Road, which lies between the two ridge lines. They have to climb over the fences on either side of the road and on into the enemy position. As it turns out, next slide, Jeff. As it turns out, only about 300 Confederates will make it over the stone wall. Led by General Lewis Armistead, a brigade commander in Pickett's division, Armistead took off his hat, and as you can see illustrated there, stuck it on the end of his sword and called out, "Who will follow me over the wall?" And about 300 Confederates, that's all, out of 12,500, make it over the wall into the Union position. Armistead is shot down, mortally wounded. He'll die in a Union hospital the next morning. 300 men who come over the wall with him are killed or captured. Pickett's charge is defeated. George Pickett's division sustains about 62% casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Let me restate it a different way. In Pickett's division, 2 of every 3 men are killed, wounded, captured, or simply never seen again. Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Well, the second principle I want to talk about in giving you this illustration from the book, and obviously there are numerous principles throughout the book, is the authority versus responsibility and leaders understanding the difference between these two concepts. You see here a painting dramatization of the Confederates returning across the field to Robert E. Lee, who positioned his horse on Seminary Ridge near where now the Virginia Monument is, to observe the attack. And as these soldiers are returning, many of them come to Robert E. Lee and they say, General Lee, let us reform our line. We'll attack that ridge one more time and we'll take it this time. And Robert E. Lee says, no, this is all my fault and you must help us now. And in the days that follow, as Robert E. Lee begins the retreat for the Army of Northern Virginia on the 4th of July, I would argue that his generalship in getting the Confederate Army safely back across the Potomac River is some of perhaps of his best generalship. But in the course of all this, he accepts full responsibility for the failure at Gettysburg and will write a letter of resignation, which he will send to Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, accepting full responsibility for failure and offering his resignation. Davis will actually, of course, reject that and say, no, you're still the finest general that I have. And through my research and discussing with Tom, I have found no instance where Robert E. Lee attempted to shirk that responsibility onto Richard Ewell for not attacking vigorously at the end of the first day, Peter Longstreet perhaps for being a bit slow on the second day, perhaps to Jeb Stuart, who we have not talked about and we can talk about in the Q&A, who's basically missing in action and doesn't appear until very, very late on the afternoon of the 2nd of July, his cavalry being fairly irrelevant as far as the whole course of this particularly important battle. But no, Lee says this was my responsibility. I think all leaders must recognize the fact that as they move up to positions of greater responsibility in whatever organization they're part of, they must give authority out to others. They can't do everything, and maximum performance of the organization can only occur if you empower others. And I've had numerous conversations with corporate leaders over the last 6 months, and obviously the crisis we're undergoing and the nature of it where people are dispersed has put more pressure, I think, on leaders to empower those who work for them, their subordinate leaders, and provide more authority because of the dispersed nature and the changing nature of the environment brought on by the pandemic. And of course, in our own history, this is perhaps epitomized by that plaque that used to sit on President Harry Truman's desk, which said, "The buck stop here. Ultimate responsibility rests with me as the person in charge. Certainly, I'll hold others accountable for failure, but in terms of how the organization succeeds or fails, that is my ultimate responsibility." Tom and I thought in talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, it was important to talk about the speech because in terms of leadership, it's clearly at a critical point of the narrative. It's the only speech I know that there are actually monuments to the speech. But Abraham Lincoln will not receive his invitation to attend the ceremonies at Gettysburg until the 2nd of November. And you see the summary of it there from Governor Curtin. David Wills on the right in this particular slide was empowered by Governor Curtin to organize this particular ceremony. So it's only a couple of weeks before the ceremony. Back in the 19th century, presidents didn't travel that much. Lincoln is not the keynote speaker. More on that in a moment. And actually, his wife very vigorously tried to convince him not to go. Their only surviving son in the White House was very ill. They had lost a son in February of 1862. And Mary Todd Lincoln thinks that child is going to die as well. And she begs Lincoln not to go to Gettysburg. But Lincoln insists, and even insists on going up the night before, because I think he had a particular purpose in mind. This gentleman is Edward Everett. He got his invitation to speak on the 23rd of September. He was a renowned orator in the 19th century. He has a fascinating resume: congressman, U.S. senator, governor of Massachusetts. He had been Secretary of State and former president of Harvard University. And some even say Lincoln may have owed him a debt of gratitude for the size of the crowd, estimated by some to be 15,000, many of whom had come to hear Edward Everett. So Everett speaks for about 2 hours. I've read the speech, not bad, but hardly memorable for 2 hours. And then Abraham Lincoln will rise to deliver a few appropriate remarks, the Gettysburg Address. Only 272 words, takes roughly 3 minutes to recite. And this is the only photograph, we believe, that shows Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg. People are surprised to see that it shows him seated. Why is that? Well, my belief is, and seems to be consistent with research, that the photographer at the time was still adjusting the lens. No one had told him the president was only going to speak very briefly. And so by the time he gets the lens straight, Lincoln has in fact sat down. Lincoln is also believed to have thought that the speech did not go very well and turned to an aide and supposedly said, "I don't think that dog hunted too well." And in fact, the Patriot News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a few miles from where I am now sitting, actually its report on the Gettysburg Address said, it was a very partisan newspaper, oh, by the way, said the president made a few stupid remarks at Gettysburg during the ceremony. That was their summary in the days that followed. I will give them credit, 150 years later, they did in fact print a retraction. But I think this is a clear example of a framework whereby a leader can use to communicate a vision or a revised vision to his or her organization. And that framework comes in 3 parts. Where have we been as an organization? Where are we right now? And where are we going? And if you take that, you can divide up the Gettysburg Address pretty quickly, even for those 272 words. Where have we been? 77 years ago. The math of that takes you back to the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln thought was the foundation document. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Where are we now? We are met on a great battlefield of this war, and it is right and proper we should do this. Where are we going? We're going to a new birth of freedom. So I would argue by this particular speech, what Lincoln has done is, up until that point, the main vision, the main purpose of the war had been to preserve the Union. That's what Lincoln had talked about in his first inaugural. Even the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the states under rebellion. And some would say once the war ended, that property should in fact be returned. But when those 15,000 depart the cemetery, I would argue there are now 2 purposes to the war. One is preserving the Union, and the other is ending slavery. So that's a third example of a leadership concept, a principle, strategic vision, how to communicate that, just to give you a taste of what we tried to do in Battle Tested. For more insights, this is the book. This is where you can obtain it. And we've also arranged that if in fact you wish to do so, and you send us an email to that book plate at diamond6leadership.com, Tom and I will be happy to mail you free of charge an autographed book plate. Ladies and gentlemen, let me wrap this up. I think, again, one of those concepts that Tom and I firmly believe is good leadership, and it's enduring across the ages. And I came across this particular inscription in something I was reading, which is on a church in Sussex, England from the 8th century, of almost 1,000 years prior to Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address. And I think it describes that idea of the importance of vision and the importance of a leader communicating. And I'm going to read it to you to conclude. A vision without a task is but a dream. A task without a vision is drudgery. And a vision and a task is the hope of the world, which is certainly what the Gettysburg Address was all about. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Tom for a Q&A. Tom.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Tom. What a great presentation, really. I appreciate all that. So we got a couple questions. First one's from Mickey Colton, and who I know is going to the Scotch night tonight. But in any case, thanks for a great presentation. Walking the ground is invaluable in understanding this battle and leadership lessons you discuss. She mentioned her first Gettysburg staff ride was as a Girl Scout, following the Boy Scout Billy Yank Johnny Reb trails. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those. It remains a vivid lesson. What difference do you see in the reception of your precepts by newbies versus old veterans? Thank you.
Hey, Tom, I'll let you, I finished up. I'll let you take a crack
I
at
didn't
that.
understand the question.
So she wants to know, how do you see the perception of the battlefield from a first-time newbie perspective versus someone like who's been a veteran or who's been there a few times?
Well, I think for the veteran Civil warrior, as I call him, there's a more nuanced understanding of what happened. A first-time visitor comes here, and they know a couple of things. They know about the Gettysburg Address. They learned that in school. Well, not depending on when you were born. The second thing is that they know Pickett's charge, but the rest of it is certainly unknown. The more experienced individual that comes here repeatedly, time after time after time after time, to learn as much as you can, and there's a lot to learn. We're still learning stuff. Stuff turns up all the time. Different interpretations, different physical objects. So they're going to have a deeper understanding. Also, they have the opportunity to develop a bias on one side or the other. So it's a give and take, goes back and forth.
Good.
I would add two quick points on if I could. One is when Tom and I began doing this, particularly the seminars, we do these seminars, part of the company that I run, with corporate leaders and groups from all across the country of different walks of life. I thought we would encounter more people who push back on us by saying, well, that's military leadership and that doesn't apply to me because I'm not in the military. I can only think of about one occasion when a lady did that very early on. And by the end of the day, we had, I think, convinced her fully that the concepts we're talking about are enduring. Doesn't matter whether it's military, business, it doesn't matter whatsoever. Second thing is we try to do in our seminars, and certainly in the book, we try to duplicate this, is force people to think about it in terms of themselves. So throughout the book, Tom will provide a historical narrative, and then we'll pose a question, which is a leadership question. Now, it's a question that a leader at that time had to confront. And we say, what would you do? And you can't, this is not a history test to determine whether you knew what John Buford did or what Strong Vincent did or whatever. It's really a test for you to think about this conceptually, applying those particular principles. And I found from talking to people who have looked at the book and talking to people that Tom and I have had on the field, people find that fascinating because it puts them in an active learning environment for them to use that case study, or for them to think about the connection between that history and the principles we're talking about.
I'd like to take that one more step further too, if I may. That one of the things that I'm involved in, and in fact, I'm involved in it today. I have a split session. I had a 3.5-hour session this morning, and when we get done here, I'll go back to another 3.5-hour session of leadership staff rides on the battlefield for the Army development program, and particularly the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC. There is a pre-commissioning requirement to do a staff ride, and a very certain thing. And of course, with the COVID, universities will not let their students travel in a lot of cases. So we're doing them virtually. And what we're using is, we're using the battlefield, just as Jeff said, we use the battlefield as a case study. And we draw into that, then we have the cadets do an analysis. They do preparation, a lot of preparation, and they're going to pull in the elements of mission command. They're going to pull in the Army values. They're going to pull in the principles of war. They're going to pull in all the attributes and competencies of leadership and tie it back to what they've read about, what we've studied about on the battlefield. And so it's a different frame of reference for them, but it provides leadership development, leadership training in a very active environment versus a sterile environment of, a lecture hall.
Great, thanks, gentlemen. So Christopher Wolf has a question about what became of the already notorious Dan Sickles, but he goes, why did he move his line up? But I want to propose something different. So I've been on that battlefield a number of times. Yeah. And when you look at that, so he moves the corps up, that core almost acts like a breakwater. It breaks up Longstreet's attack.
Yeah.
It brings it up on the rocks. And I mean, yeah, he did disobey orders. I got that. But in some cases, that really caused a breakup and almost to split that assault coming at that section of the core. So if you could talk a little bit about Dan Sickles and discuss the little action as it was.
Hey, Tom, why don't you talk about him advancing up, and then I'll talk about what happened to him. How's that sound?
All right. So what the reason Sickles went forward is this. He's assigned a position back there that's going to extend the Union defensive line down Cemetery Ridge to Little Round Top. Unfortunately, as he saw it, just north of Little Round Top, the line along Cemetery Ridge goes into a pretty good depression for a pretty long way. And so I've measured it on the map by satellite. All right. That ground that he was to occupy just north of Little Round Top is 40 feet lower than the ground out on the Emmitsburg Road in the vicinity of the Peach Orchard where he moved his troops. He moved them because in the Battle of Chancellorsville, at a place called Hazel Grove, he was in a position that he was ordered to vacate into a lower position, and the Confederate artillery occupied the higher position and shot the Confederate artillery down into his lower position and blew them apart. He did not want to have that happen again. Therefore, without orders, without permission, he did consult with Meade, but never got permission to do it. He did it anyway. He moved his troops forward 3/4 of a mile, created that salient between the main Union defense and the attack positions of the Confederates. So having set him in place, that happened just before the Confederate attack.
Mm-hmm.
Having set them in place, then Jeff wants to fight him back. Go
That
ahead.
acted as almost as a disruption, as a disruptive effect
Right.
on that assault. So
It's a breakwater. It's a breakwater.
Right.
It's a defense. He unintentionally creates.
You read a lot of books though, stories, and they say that was. I mean, obviously he didn't listen, but that may have turned in some cases that day.
Accidentally creates defense in depth. Dan Sickles was no military genius. All right. So,
And that's a good point for Jeff to talk about what happened to him.
Well, I often come back to a principle my father taught me, which is if you have a choice between being lucky or good, always pick lucky. And I would also point out that the breakwater theory, which I happen to subscribe to, only works if Strong Vincent does what Strong Vincent does.
True.
If that doesn't happen, then this all becomes somewhat academic. Tom always teases me that Strong Vincent's my favorite of all the generals at Gettysburg. There are 10 corps commanders.
No, Sickles.
Sickles, yes, forgive me. There are 10 corps commanders at Gettysburg, Confederate and Union, and he is the only one who is not a West Point graduate. I'd like to point that out. He is actually a politician, and he had been a leading part of the Tammany Hall political machine from the city of New York. Abraham Lincoln, a very shrewd politician, makes a number of Democrats generals. It's one way to keep the Democratic Party in the war, at least for the first couple of years. And Sickles is one of them. Sickles is actually somewhat famous in the legal profession because prior to the war, he is a congressman in Washington. He uncovers what he believes is that his wife is having an affair with the son of Francis Scott Key, who's a friend of his. He invites Key to meet him in Lafayette Park, only about a block or so from the club one afternoon. And as Key is walking up, Sickles pulls a revolver and pumps several bullets into his chest, killing him on the spot. He is tried for this particular murder. This is prior to the Civil War. He selects Edwin Stanton, very famous attorney who becomes Secretary of the War for Abraham Lincoln, to defend him. And Stanton will create the defense of temporary insanity and get Sickles off. And that's how he becomes a general during the Civil War. He is badly wounded at Gettysburg. He loses a leg. And story has it, as he's carried off the field on a stretcher, he is smoking a cigar and insists that they strap the leg on the stretcher. He said, I was very attached to that leg. So they take it along, and he has that preserved. After the war is over, he is made ambassador to Spain by General Grant. And he goes off to Spain, gets off the boat in Cadiz, Spain, has a press conference, and roundly renounces the Spanish government, the king, for not ceding Cuba to the United States. This is in the 1870s, because many Americans thought that Cuba should be part of the U.S. It is alleged, this may get now towards myth, but it's fun, that he has an affair with the Queen of Spain and has to flee from Spain. Grant makes him then the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, it is alleged that he has either gets into the harem for the emperor of the Ottoman Empire or has an affair with one of the members of the harem, has to flee the Ottoman Empire, and he is made ambassador without portfolio, wanders around Europe for a year or so at taxpayer expense to return to the United States to be reelected to the United States Congress. When you go to Gettysburg, there is a monument to the Third Corps, his corps, not far from the wheat field. And in the center of that, it was designed supposedly to have a bust of Sickles. There is no bust because it also is alleged that he embezzled a large portion of the money dedicated to the monument for his own personal use. And then last but not least, as he gets older and older, he actually preserved that leg, had it put in a box, and it hung over the bar at his men's club in New York. And when he would have dinner with his most, kind of like going to the Army Navy Club, when he would have dinner with his most current girlfriend, he would insist they remove the box and place the box with his leg on it on the table as a conversation piece. This was quite a guy, and you can learn lessons, good lessons, or lessons about leadership from good examples and from bad examples.
Jeff, isn't that leg preserved at Walter Reed Medical Museum? You can see it in DC when it's open.
Yeah, this very day, and obviously now it's just a bone, but yeah, it is still there. He also, by the way, one last thing I forgot, he also supposedly from his hospital bed a few days after the battle, writes a story about the Battle of Gettysburg, which is printed in a major New York newspaper under the pseudonym Americus, in which he goes on about how the exploits of General Sickles actually turned the tide and was the key thing for the Union victory. Of course, he was writing about himself, and he is awarded a Medal of Honor. So he covered a lot of bases.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so Joe LaPonte mentions, as a fellow West Point grad, a class of 08, my son also was a classmate of yours, and Fletcher of 19 grad, I thank you both for being here. From the research and reading I've done in the Civil War, one of the interesting takeaways is that the entire Battle of Gettysburg was not a pre-planned operational engagement. Could you talk about the importance of adaptability for senior leaders based on initiative of junior leaders?
Yeah, Tom, let you pick that up, and then I'll take the other end as well.
Well, it was not a pre-planned engagement. It's going to be a meeting engagement. But the Confederate Army they come across the Potomac into Maryland and Pennsylvania seeking a decisive victory over the Northern Army on Northern soil, but also to gather up food. They have a food shortage in the South at the beginning of the third year of the war. So these rich farms in Maryland and Pennsylvania, they're going to gather up 24,000 head of cattle, 22,000 head of sheep, thousands of hogs, hundreds of wagons filled with food and forage in Maryland and Pennsylvania to send it south. So all that's going on, but it's going to be interrupted by the arrival then of the Union Army crossing the Potomac River, also coming up through Frederick, Maryland, from Maryland into Pennsylvania, trying to get up to where they can get at the Confederates and drive them out of Pennsylvania. So that's what's going to trigger the battle. Neither commander determined this is where it was going to be, but the movement of the troops, movement of Buford's cavalry division on the 29th and 30th of June into this area, and the presence of the Confederates in the area, then those two sides, once they come together, they're going to start fighting. So initially, it's a meeting engagement. Neither Confederate General Lee nor Union General Meade decided Gettysburg was going to be the point where the battle is going to take place. It is a likely point for it to take place because there are 10 major roads that come into the center of this village that help with the movement of these 90,000 Union soldiers and 70,000 Confederate soldiers, all total, but very spread out. And it takes 2 days, really, before everybody's here for the battle.
Tom, was that by rail at all? Did they move by rail, or is it all on foot?
No, all the railroad, for the Confederates, all the rail lines north of Staunton, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley have been destroyed. So there's no rail movement. And then the railroads, the Confederates, will have been here before the Union troops, and they destroy the area, the rail lines in the area that surround Gettysburg. So there's initially no rail transportation. Eventually there will be for the Union side, but not for the Confederates.
Okay.
I would add to that, clearly this is part and parcel of, if you will, the general strategic objective of Robert E. Lee, which is to have a major battle on Union soil at a place of his choosing. And that's where this starts to start falling apart. I think it's also illustrative of the fact that you have two two corps commanders, Richard Ewell and Ambrose Powell Hill, who have been recently elevated to corps command. Lee does something interesting, and that is he reorganizes his command from 2 corps to 3 corps shortly before the battle, and has to elevate somebody to corps command because of the death of Stonewall Jackson. So these guys, Ewell and Hill, are now commanding at a whole new level, which requires them to anticipate and think in time. They can't be as direct a leader as they could in divisional command. That's part of the problem. In addition, I spoke about Ewell for a moment in terms of the leadership principles that illustrates. Hill as well receives a message from Robert E. Lee, you know, consolidate at Gettysburg, but don't get decisively engaged until everybody is there. And of course, he ignores or screws that one up, and they become decisively engaged on July 1st. So when Lee arrives late that day, he's a little bit irritated. But the point that the questioner asked is exactly right. And what we talk about a lot using those examples is that for any organization, you have to adapt, you have to innovate and think about what innovation means and create a climate that encourages innovation. And then you have to overcome and make sure that you have a determination as a leader that you, in fact, can overcome whatever the current obstacle is. And as we all used to say in the military, I saw that in my command during the Gulf War. I'm sure Tom saw it in Vietnam. We have that great saying, no plan survives the first round fired. You know, Dwight Eisenhower used to say, the plan is nothing, but planning is everything. That gives you the guardrails between which you're going to operate. But for goodness sake, Tom and I were at Normandy. And of course, people forget that we actually land troops at the wrong beach at Utah. They actually end up at the wrong place, but they have to adapt from there. And that's true for any organization.
So Jeff, you talked a little bit about you know, the Confederate generals who had to get fleeted up. So Ryan Weddle mentions, can you briefly speak to leadership of those division commanders who had to take over Army corps due to the commanders being killed or disabled? He mentions, of course, Sickles, Reynolds, and Hancock.
Yeah, I'll let Tom talk about that, because from the historical standpoint, I think he's better at that. I would simply say one thing that we stress a lot is there's a real difference in this particular war in terms of how you think about leadership between being a divisional commander and being a corps commander or above. In the American Civil War, the general frontage for a division was planned to be about a mile. Now that was a planning factor and not an absolute. It was going to be affected by terrain. But at a mile, a divisional commander still had the possibility at least, to see where his units were going in, his brigades were going in, send couriers and messengers, do more of that, do less of that. He still had the opportunity at least to provide a direct leadership to his organization. When you go to corps command, that goes away. And it's a whole new ball game. And now you have to think in time, you have to anticipate, you have to lead through others. And so I think one of the key things that really causes the Confederates a lot of problems, Hill and Ewell I think are illustrative, is they're just getting through that. They're making that transition. And oh, by the way, back to initiative, both of them had come from the School of Initiative, which was taught by a guy named Stonewall Jackson. And Stonewall Jackson's School of Initiative began with the following phrase: watch my lips, do exactly what I tell you to do when I tell you, and then come back and look at my lips again. And ostensibly had more officers on court-martial charges for violating his orders than the rest of the Confederate Army combined. But Tom, do you want to specifically talk about those 3 Union divisional commanders?
Well, on the Union side, I will use the analogy of a sports team. You can name the sport, but they speak of bench strength. And so Reynolds was killed early in the fighting on the first day. So Senior Division Commander Abner Doubleday will step up and take command of the First Corps. And Doubleday actually does all right, in my view, in my study of it. He's going to be relieved of command based on some statements that a couple of others will make that were incorrect. But so he's gone. Hancock's going to be wounded at the end of the battle, and he'll move off, but he'll be ably succeeded by his senior division commander. And so they have all the system set up that they achieved at the beginning of the 3rd year of the war in terms of bench strength, what they could not ever have done in the first year of the war. and that is that experience level. And we've sorted out, we've sifted out, we've gone through, we've moved some guys out that proved not to be worthy enough. And there's a learning curve. We brought the others up, where Caldwell will come in and replace Hancock. Doubleday will replace Reynolds initially, and then we're gonna make some more arrangements after the battle's over. But we've got a succession in command that will take place for the Union. And if you go into further detail on the Confederate side, you'll find some real holes. When General Hood, as an example, division commander, is wounded, it's well over an hour to 2 hours before anyone realizes the division commander is no longer in command. And so the guy that will succeed him, who will be the commander of the Alabama Brigade, he goes 2 hours before realizing he is the commander now of the division. And so there are those kinds of problems on the Confederate side below the corps level. And one of the concerns that Lee had coming into this campaign is he was concerned about the abilities of the leaders, because they had lost so many good leaders. He was concerned about their capabilities, and he writes about it. He makes it a matter of writing. He records it, and it's not just a passing thing in his mind. And it's something that he's concerned about. And he makes a statement that this army would be invincible if properly led.
So, gentlemen, we're actually out of time, but if it's okay, I'll go on a couple more minutes if that's
Sure.
okay with you.
Yeah.
So we do have quite a few questions. So
I'm not due till 14:30, so I got.
there we go. Okay, so
now.
here's a question. So Al Short mentions this, and in fact, he's hitting on one of my favorite generals, I think, who maybe a little unsung or even misinterpreted. That's Meade. So Meade takes command of Union forces just days before the battle, gets up there, gets an assessment. What was his role, and what's your assessment about him in the bigger picture, even following that? Because I think sometimes Grant gets over there, Grant comes east. In some cases, it overshadows him. And so what's your take? Over.
Tom, why don't you start, and I'll do the back.
Want me to start? All right, we'll start. So here's Meade. It's actually 3 days before the battle begins. He's appointed to command. And he's, in my view, he's going to do a satisfactory job. He's going to stay initially when they figure out the battle is going to be at Gettysburg. He stays down in Tawnytown, Maryland, Meade does. He doesn't immediately come up. He takes General Winfield Scott Hancock, commander of the Second Corps, and writes a letter to whom it may concern, gives it to Hancock, that says Hancock is in charge till Meade gets to Gettysburg. Hancock takes off for Gettysburg. Meade stays in Maryland. Why? Why would he do that? Communications, because he's got good telegraph communications with Washington. Not only does he provide information to Washington, most importantly, he's receiving intelligence information from Washington. What does Washington know? Washington knows what the governor of Pennsylvania is telling them about Confederate locations, troop movements, size, activity. Where does the governor of Pennsylvania get that? He gets it from the Cumberland Valley Railroad stations in the Cumberland Valley. They run all the way up to Harrisburg. So all this intelligence information is coming all the way around and back to Meade at his headquarters in Tawnytown. Then he picks the appropriate time to come to Gettysburg, arriving at midnight after all of the first day's fighting has gone on. And he takes command. So we have the second day of fighting that's going to go on. And then after the second day, Meade's going to convene this Council of War. And this is where historians differ, just as the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War disagreed over Meade calling a Council of War. Well, today in the modern time, we call it an orders group, you see. He has to make a decision on what he's going to do in the third day. And so he has to have information. The fastest, most expedient, most thorough way he can get information is call subordinate commanders together and have them report to him casualties, morale of the troops, capabilities, ammunition left, can you continue to defend, can you continue to attack. And so he's going to take that initiative and he's going to get that information and a decision will be made. A decision, yeah, they're going to vote. Meade didn't call for the vote, his chief of staff called for the vote. But They make a decision. So he's got everybody in the boat rowing the same boat, the same direction, come the morning of July 3rd to repel Pickett's charge. Jeff.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is the contrast between Lee and Meade. I find just fascinating. On the one hand, you have Robert E. Lee. He's been in command about 18 months. He has won every battle he's been involved with the possible exception of the Battle of Antietam. You could call that a draw, if you will. He's a flipping rock star. Okay, I mean, this guy is a flipping rock star, and he'd been a rock star before the war in many ways because of his heroism during the Mexican War and his career up to that particular point. And that may be a problem for him because, you know, who has the courage as a subordinate leader to tell the boss, that's really a dumb idea, boss. I really don't think we ought to do that. In this case, it's doubly difficult because of his four principal subordinates, one is Jeb Stuart, who's absent and obviously discredited for the moment at least. Two of them are Richard Ewell and Ambrose Powell Hill, are brand new as Corps commanders. Very difficult for them to tell the boss, hey boss, I've been in command about 2 days here as a Corps commander and I think you're wrong. And the third one is Pete Longstreet. Tom described the dilemma that Longstreet goes through, which I would always talk about as a moral dilemma in his opposition to continuing the attack on the second day and certainly Pickett's charge. And the night before, as Tom described, of course, Meade has this orders group meeting. And I think it's back to that definition of leadership by Eisenhower, get people to want to do it. He's only been in command now 4 days. I think there is pressure on him to get buy-in from his immediate subordinates, who all probably thought, A, they were a better general than he was because he had been a Corps commander only 5 days ago. They probably thought they were better looking than he was, as most generals think about each other along the way. About a mile from where that meeting is held, of course, is Robert E. Lee's headquarters. And what happens that night? Well, the best of our research, Robert E. Lee pretty much stays to himself. He takes his own counsel. He doesn't call in an orders group. He now believes he is the one that makes the decision. So you got one guy bringing his group together, getting buy-in. The other guy, the rock star, who has nobody who can tell him perhaps at that moment he is in fact wrong. Second, as Tom described, and I'll expand on it, Meade is making what I would call informed decisions. Because back to innovation, one thing the Yankees had done that he inherited was a colonel by the name of Sharp had created at the headquarters for the Army of Potomac what we would call an intel analysis group. Now that's a bit of an overstatement, rudimentary to take those disparate pieces of intelligence using crude matrices to be able to describe the enemy that you're up against. And by the afternoon, evening of the second day, he can pretty much give Meade a full laydown of who is here by interviews of prisoners of war, other disparate pieces of information they have gathered. The Confederates have nothing like that, and that's why it's interesting when they call for Pickett's charge, Lee thinks it's going to be 15,000. As Tom said, it's only 12,500. It looks like he hasn't even got a really good idea about how many casualties his own army has taken in the 2 days prior to that. And then last but not least, between Lee, I think it's interesting, think about Meade in the context of him and Abraham Lincoln. When the battle is over, Meade will send a telegram to Lincoln in which he says, Mr. President, we have successfully defended the nation from invasion. He's feeling pretty good. I just won 15 rounds with a heavyweight champion of the world and came out on top. Now, they've only been in charge for 2 days, so he's feeling pretty good about himself. Lincoln is despondent, and he is despondent, of course, because Meade did not pursue, and there was perhaps an opportunity to end the war at that moment. And again, historians will argue that endlessly. I believe myself, as a military officer, that he could have pursued more vigorously, and he could have perhaps made that opportunity come to life. We'll never know. Lincoln, and this is more a tribute to his leadership we talk about in the book, actually writes a letter to me in response to that telegram. And he says, my dear General, you can't defend the nation. It's one nation, and you let Bobby Lee get away. He folds that letter up, sticks it in an envelope, puts it in his desk drawer, goes about his business that day, comes back the next morning, and never sends that letter out. It is never sent. And I think this is a lesson for leaders that you never want to make a decision when you're really angry. And if you have the opportunity to take more time and think about it, that can often be to your benefit. Tom, back over to you.
No, I think we kind of.
Tom is the host. Sorry. Tom W.
Oh,
No
the other
problem.
one. Yeah,
Thanks,
okay.
gentlemen. Okay, so Brian Salerno mentions he heard that Lee's decision to attack the center on the third day was influenced by his success as Chancellorsville under similar circumstances. To what extent are leaders ill-served from their past experiences?
Again, Tom, I'll let you start on that one, and then I'll come in behind, if you don't mind.
Well, what Lee in Lee's case, what he failed to recognize a couple things. One, the success at Chancellorsville. He's going to have a very good victory there, but it's going to be costly. Not just Jackson, but a lot of casualties, a lot of key leaders. His army has changed, right? His assets have changed. I don't believe he recognized that. I don't believe he recognized at Gettysburg, as an example, that he isn't talking to Stonewall Jackson when he gives Ewell that discretionary order to seize the high ground to your front. He's not talking to Ewell. He's talking to Jackson. Jackson's still there in his mind, but it's not the same guy. And so his army has changed, and his opponent has also changed. These boys now, the Union Army, they're defending their home ground. They've also gone through in their organization a reorganization of their army. More of the deadwood has been cast out, and the chain of command has changed for the positive, for the better. And so to say you can go from one experience based on that, take the same experience to the next fight, no. Not if you can't factor in the changes that have taken place in the assets from one victory to what should be the next victory. You've got to take account for what happened. And in the case of Lee, I don't believe he did that.
Yeah, I would add that I'm a firm believer in that catchphrase that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So I think that obviously from the book we wrote, we think people can learn great lessons of leadership from history. But clearly what you have to do in making decisions and trying to draw on what has happened in the past is tease out what are the implicit and explicit assumptions that we're making. And I think too oftentimes leaders move ahead without a real hard effort involving many of their key subordinate leaders on what are the key assumptions that we're making here explicitly and explicitly, and how is the environment perhaps different. Second of all, I firmly believe that effective leaders show a certain amount of humility. And I believe Dwight Eisenhower was one of those guys. Don't read your press clippings too closely. You know, I think Robert E. Lee, who was a great operational commander, no doubt about it, I think tended to, at this point, read his press clippings a little too closely. And humility also, I think, allows you to be open to your senior subordinates, at least telling you honestly what you think you should do and not do. Doesn't mean you have to listen to them, but having those voices is critically important. Though every leader has to understand the one thing about leadership is you have to decide, you control the clock. That's a critical resource for the organization. And it is lonely. It is lonely at the top because you're going to decide. And one great lesson I learned from my time in the Pentagon, I'm sure a number of people on this call spent some time, I know Tom did, working in the Pentagon. I learned very early on as a staff officer that success has 1,000 fathers and mothers and failure is an orphan, okay? And there's no two ways about that, but leadership is lonely.
So I got one last question. It's more of a story. And so I don't know if many people know, but I just finished a book on Normandy. And one of the big characters, obviously, is General Dwight D. Eisenhower. But on the other hand, one of his friction points is another general by the name of Bernard Montgomery. And I believe that he, in the 50s, maybe after, probably even 60s, after Eisenhower left the office, he settled in a farm not far from Utah. And Monty came to visit. Can you give us a little anecdote what that was like? Because I heard it was not quite as smooth as it was. And who did the teaching on that?
Yeah, I'll give you that story, Tom. But tell me first, which Normandy book did you just finish?
It was Holland's book, James Holland, Normandy 44.
Yep. Excellent.
And I also finished Beaver. I go in spurts, so yeah. I do that.
Jeff and I were over there last September, and so I spent my summer last year reading up and getting ready, and so we spent a whole week over there. So good. All right, so the Eisenhower farm is about 4 miles from where I'm sitting now on my farm. And people kid me about, well, so you're at Gettysburg like Ike with a farm and all that. I said, no, no, no. I said, I don't have a farm manager. I raise cattle, but not the same kind he did. And so, no, but here's the story that happens, is that Montgomery had written a book, as Eisenhower had written a book. It's from the proceeds of his book that he's going to buy this farm, 182 acres. And so he's got his farm here at Gettysburg. Montgomery writes his book, and he's going to come to America. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery comes to America on a book tour. Couldn't do virtual book talks like we do now. So he comes on a book tour. So he's going to stop and stay at the Eisenhower farm. And then he's got a whole circuit that he's going to ride of stops throughout the country to include down in the South. He's going to do these book tours. And so at the Eisenhower farm, though, there's a problem, because Mrs. Eisenhower definitely does not care for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Therefore, he cannot stay in the guest room in the main house. He has to sleep in the carriage house. All right, so that's point number one. So anyway, they're at Gettysburg. So these two venerable generals are going to make a tour of the Gettysburg battlefield. Now think of the day. It's 1950s. There's no mass big television. You know, it's not like it is here in the 21st century. But they got a lot of newspaper people that are going to follow these generals around the field as Ike is telling the story to the field marshal as they go around and around. So here we come to day 3, and they're over on West Confederate Avenue, and at the departure point for Pickett's charge of the Pettigrew and Trimble's boys, of the North Carolinians. And as they're studying the terrain, the field marshal allegedly shakes his head and he said, "Oh, I could not understand what Lee was thinking when he ordered those men to march across this open space against that artillery fire to attack against an enemy behind us. I can't understand the whole thing." And Ike says something to the effect, "Well, yes, if you had done that during the war, I would have relieved you of command." And so, meanwhile, these newspaper guys are standing back there and they're taking these copious notes. Well, that was the last day that Montgomery's going to be at the farm, next to the last day. So the next day, he's there before he leaves the farm. There's a phone call from Montgomery, Alabama, the mayor, which was, Montgomery was the next stop on this book tour Montgomery was supposed to be on. And it's the mayor to tell Montgomery, don't bother coming down to Montgomery. We read the syndicated newspaper report of your criticism of General Lee at Gettysburg, and you are not welcome. In fact, your life will be in danger if you come. That's the story.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much. I'm sorry we don't have any more questions. We have time for questions, but I do appreciate it. And really, it's a great opportunity to have you here and really bring this leadership to, lesson to life. Looking forward to your book. I had one question though, was where do they get the book plate? What was what was the email address? Do you remember that one?
Yeah, if you, in fact, I can pop that up and hang on a second. If you go to this particular website, or send me, an email to bookplate@diamond6leadership.com and spell out the 6. We will be more than happy to mail you a free book plate, and there's more information you can get about us and our organization at these websites. So info, bookplate@diamond6leadership.com. And I might add, by the way, if anyone has a question that we didn't get answered, if you email me at that email address, info@diamond6leadership.com, we will endeavor to answer that question. Thank you.
That's perfect, gentlemen. And I do appreciate it. I'll send you an email pretty soon. I'll give you some dates for Fox Connor Society.
Great.
It's a different crowd in the evenings and they're a lot younger, or at least a mix, but I do appreciate all the detail and really you brought this battle to life. And I think you showed how, that leadership back then can play a role today as leaders we are in corporate and society. So thank you very much. Go ahead, Tom.
Here's 2 more book possibilities: A Field Guide to Gettysburg, A Field Guide to Antietam.
I've got that one.
All right, there you go.
I think I might have them both actually, but in any case, thank you, gentlemen. I do appreciate it. And to all those who are listening in from Army and Navy Club, we'll see you around Zoom or at the club. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Tom, see you.
Yep.
See ya.